Welcome to Focus BC. I'm Richard Zussman in for Sonia Diol this week. After years of waiting, it's finally here. But will ride-hailing be what everyone is expecting in British Columbia? Here's Transportation Minister Claire Trevena from earlier this week.
I know people were frustrated. I know people wanted it immediately. I was as frustrated as everyone in the time it seemed to be taking. But I think in the end, we're going to feel people in BC can feel very comfortable in the service they'll be getting.
Both Uber and Lyft, the two largest companies in the world, now operating in Vancouver and at the airport. But that's it. For more on this issue, I'm joined by the chair of the Mayor's Council and the Mayor of New Westminster, Jonathan Cote. Mayor, thank you for doing this.
No, well, thanks for having me on the show.
So now we know that these companies are operating. Isn't it all frustrating to you that Lyft's only operating in the city of Vancouver and the airport, and Uber's region is not much larger than that?
Yeah, well, it is early days, but we do anticipate that as things start to set up, and particularly once the region is able to set up our regional framework, that we are going to see it to grow, expand throughout the region.
How much have you heard about this in New Westminster? Is something that the citizens of your community are wanting to see on the road?
Yeah, I think there's definitely some residents in New Westminster that feel that ride-hailing will provide a few more transportation options. New Westminster is really well served by public transit, so I think where we're hearing the largest voices is the parts of the region that are more on the periphery that may not have as good of access to rapid transit in the region.
So let's talk about that. So what we're looking at now is these major companies are launching in the city of Vancouver. I know the Mayor's Council is working on a regional ride-hailing business license. When do you think that license may be in place?
Yeah, so back in December, the Mayor's Council adopted a policy that we were going to set up a regional framework by the end of January. And since that time, all of the cities have been working very collaboratively together to develop that. And my understanding is that work is on track, and to expect an announcement by the end of January or early February on the work that's been completed.
And does that mean that these companies can't operate right now in municipalities outside? We know that the business licenses are in place for Vancouver, but in other places where Uber wants to operate, Burnaby, New Westminster, can they not operate right now? So
actually, they can operate. As an example, in New Westminster, we don't have any regulations in place. We plan to join the regional framework, but in the meantime, ride-hailing companies are actually open to operate in our city. But once we join the regional framework, they'll have to have a regional license to be able to do so.
When the Mayor's Council voted on the regional business license, everyone voted in favor of it except for Surrey. What do you think that means for ride-hailing in Surrey, but also potentially for ride-hailing in the entire region?
Yeah, so ultimately, the regional framework is going to have to be approved by every individual city council. From everything I'm hearing, I would expect the vast majority of municipalities in Metro Vancouver to approve and support this direction. But it is possible that one or two cities, like the city of Surrey, may not join that framework. So that'll mean one or two things. Number one, the city of Surrey could choose to actually just issue no licenses. In that scenario, it means ride-hailing companies will be able to operate freely with no regulations in the city of Surrey. Or the city of Surrey could alternatively create their own regulations, and then it would be up to the ride-hailing companies whether they chose to operate in Surrey or not.
And do you think that has an effect on the way the region works when the second largest city in the province decides not to participate?
I obviously we're early days in this work, and I am encouraged that how well the cities have been able to work together on this, particularly under a lot of time constraints. So I think the long-term vision, it still makes a lot of sense that all of us work together with one regional structure, and I'm hoping in the long term that even if we do have one or two holdouts at the beginning, that eventually we're able to all come together with one system.
And one of the things as well that's controversial are the players here. Two major American companies. Uber especially comes with it a lot of controversy. What do you think of Uber as a company?
Yeah, well, I'll speak more broadly to ride-hailing because I think it's a double-edged sword. In one way, I think ride-hailing has proven in other jurisdictions that it can actually provide new transportation options that are underserved in cities, and that could certainly have a real benefit in our region. I think of even creating last-mile trips to connect communities to SkyTrain that currently are just too far to SkyTrain. Provides a huge opportunity. But we've also seen negative impacts in other cities as well, too. In other major places like New York and Chicago, they've actually seen increased congestion in their road network because of ride-hailing. And, as a region where we already struggle with congestion, adding anything that could actually make congestion worse in the region does cause concerns. So, the Mayor's Council is going to be very closely watching, and certainly part of the regulations we're looking at is actually being able to collect all of the data from the ride-hailing, so we have a good understanding of how ride-hailing is helping our transportation system, but also having a good understanding of how it might be having a negative impact as well.
And Mayor, last question for you. Do you think it could have an impact on transit and how much people are using transit?
Yeah, there's no doubt we're going to be watching that as well, too, because in some jurisdictions, there has been a direct correlation to ride-hailing actually decreasing public transit use, and that could have a really negative impact on the region to be able to deliver public transit. So we are hopeful that we're able to mitigate that and actually be able to use ride-hailing to make it easier for people to get to transit, but we also recognize it could very well create more competition and could end up undermining our public transit system.
Mayor, thank you so much for doing this.
Okay, thank you.
For more on this, let's bring in Keith Baldry, who's in Victoria. All right, Keith, you and I have talked a lot about this over the last few years. Should British Columbians be celebrating right now that ride-sharing is finally here?
Well, I found it very interesting, Mayor Cote's comments at the interview with him, talking about this being a double-edged sword, that he's going to be collecting, the Mayor's Council will be collecting data to show the impact or examine the impact it's having on public transit, for example. As he mentions, a number of jurisdictions have seen a decrease in public transit use with the introduction of ride-hailing on a significant scale. So I think the jury's out here on just how big an impact ride-hailing will have and whether all of it's going to be positive. We've seen a lot of stories, and you know full well about Uber's sort of checkered history here of passenger safety being compromised in some jurisdictions. We had actual driver strikes as well in a number of U.S. cities last year, New York, Chicago, Denver, where Uber drivers staged a one-day strike protesting working conditions and low pay. So we're at the beginning of a new experience. I still think the jury's out just how positive ultimately is going to prove to be and just what type of impact and how much of it will be positive on the general population.
And one of the interesting things about the working conditions is the Labour Relations Board here in BC is right now looking at the issue. The UFCW brought forward this issue that they believe that Uber and Lyft drivers should be employees of the company. Do you think this is potentially something that could end up in the favor of the UFCW, and we could see the Labour Relations Board saying, well, these people have to be employees, and that could damage the business model?
It could damage the business model, and this is why it's going to be interesting to see this case go forward. This now creates a new industry that is potentially open for unionization. Of course, unions are going to take a look at this and start potentially embarking on organizing drives to try to create unions in this workplace. It will have an impact potentially on the economic model here. I think already it's been demonstrated the economic model for individual drivers is sort of razor thin at best, and it's going to be interesting whether if there's deemed to be employees, as is the case in California, if that's the case in BC, that could upset the apple cart here and make this venture not as profitable perhaps as in other jurisdictions. BC, particularly with the NDP government in place, is traditionally very strong when it comes to employment standards, and I don't see that being reversed here.
And quickly, the other thing the NDP has made a big issue around is safety and creating this Class 4 license. When the companies say this commercial license requirement has meant they can't have many drivers on the road, we're only seeing this now at the airport in Vancouver. Do you see any way that the province backs down on this Class 4 requirement?
No, I don't think so. As I said before, ride-hailing is not near and dear to the NDP's political DNA. I mean, you don't hear this issue being talked about by New Democrats over the years. It's a relatively new arrival on the scene. And you and I have talked in the past on previous focus shows about this is sort of the ultimate open market, free market industry with minimal regulation. That's not a traditional NDP go-to area. So I don't see them relaxing the rules here. Claire Trevena, the Transportation Minister, has been very clear. She equates Class 4 requirements with passenger safety, even though there's not necessarily data to back that up, I don't see her changing her position.
All right, Keith, stick around because after the break, the city